The cellar door slammed shut above Adelaide's head with a finality that echoed through her bones, and she heard the heavy iron bolt slide into place, sealing her in darkness so complete she could not see her own trembling hands. It was November 1885, and her stepfather, Harold Duncan, had just imprisoned her beneath their weathered ranch house outside Tombstone, Arizona, his whiskey-soaked breath still lingering in her memory, along with his final words that she would stay down there until spring taught her obedience. The earthen walls pressed close around her 18-year-old frame as she sank onto the cold dirt floor, her calico dress offering little protection against the chill that crept up from the ground, and she wrapped her arms around herself while tears streaked down her dust-covered cheeks. Her mother had died 6 months earlier from consumption, leaving Adelaide alone with a man who had grown meaner with each passing week, his true nature revealing itself without her mother's gentle presence to temper his cruelty. The ranch had belonged to Adelaide's father, who had perished in a mining accident when she was only 12, and her mother had married Harold 3 years later out of desperation and the need for a man to help run the cattle operation. Harold had seemed kind enough during their courtship, but Adelaide had learned too late that some men wore masks until they felt secure enough to remove them. The cellar was perhaps 12 feet square, with rough-hewn support beams holding up the floorboards of the house above, and Adelaide could hear Harold's heavy footsteps as he walked across the main room, probably heading for the whiskey bottle he kept on the kitchen shelf. There was a thin shaft of light that filtered through the gap where the cellar doors met, but it was fading fast as evening approached, and Adelaide knew she would soon be plunged into absolute darkness. She felt along the walls with shaking fingers, searching for anything that might help her, but found only the expected supplies: sacks of potatoes, jars of preserves her mother had put up last summer, barrels that smelled of apples and grain. Her fingers brushed against a rough wool blanket folded on a wooden crate, and she grabbed it gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders as the temperature continued to drop. November nights in Arizona could be surprisingly cold, especially this far from town, and Adelaide knew the winter months ahead would test every ounce of her strength. She had defied Harold that afternoon by refusing to sign over the deed to her father's ranch, the property that was rightfully hers now that her mother had passed, and his rage had been swift and terrible. The darkness became total as night fell, and Adelaide curled into a ball on the earthen floor, the blanket pulled tight around her body, and she whispered prayers her mother had taught her as a child. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the scurrying of mice and the creaking of the house settling above her, and when morning finally arrived with thin strips of gray light seeping through the door cracks, Adelaide felt as though she had aged years in a single night. Days blended into weeks as November gave way to December, and Harold's pattern became grimly predictable. He would come once a day, always at noon, sliding a tin plate of cold beans or stale bread through a gap he created by opening one door just a few inches, never wide enough for Adelaide to attempt escape. He would demand to know if she was ready to sign the papers, and when she refused, he would slam the door shut again and leave her in darkness. A bucket served her basic needs, and Harold would replace it every few days with obvious disgust, never meeting her eyes, treating her like an animal he was keeping penned up. The cold intensified as winter settled over the Arizona territory, and Adelaide's fingers grew numb despite her efforts to keep moving in the confined space. She exercised as best she could, walking in circles, stretching her limbs, refusing to let her body grow weak even as her hope began to fade. The preserves and stored vegetables became her supplementary food when Harold's portions proved too meager, and she rationed them carefully, knowing they might be all that kept her alive through the long months ahead. Christmas came and went without acknowledgement, just another day of darkness and cold, and the gnawing ache of loneliness that threatened to overwhelm Adelaide's spirit. She talked to herself to keep her mind sharp, reciting poems her mother had loved, singing hymns in a voice that grew hoarse from the dry air, telling stories about the life she would build once she escaped this nightmare. Because she would escape, she told herself fiercely during the worst moments. She would survive, and she would reclaim her father's ranch, and she would see Harold Duncan face justice for what he had done. January brought storms that rattled the cellar doors and sent water seeping through cracks in the earthen walls, turning the floor to mud that Adelaide tried unsuccessfully to avoid. Her dress grew filthy and tattered, her hair became a tangled mess, and she developed a cough that worried her during the long nights when she lay shivering beneath the inadequate blanket. Harold seemed not to care about her deteriorating condition, and Adelaide realized with growing horror that he might actually let her die down here, that his greed for the ranch property had consumed whatever shred of humanity he once possessed. February arrived with bitter winds that found every gap in the cellar doors and set Adelaide's teeth chattering uncontrollably for hours on end. She had lost weight, her dress hanging loose on her frame, and she knew her appearance would shock anyone who might see her. But who would see her? The ranch was isolated miles from Tombstone, and Harold had always been careful to maintain a veneer of respectability in town, telling anyone who asked that his stepdaughter had gone to live with relatives in California. It was the third week of February when Adelaide heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch, followed by a knock on the front door of the house. She pressed her ear against the cellar floor, straining to hear the voices above, and caught fragments of conversation. A man's voice, deep and unfamiliar, asking questions. Harold's responses, defensive and curt. Something about looking to buy cattle, about needing to speak with Duncan about a business arrangement. Adelaide's heart hammered in her chest as she realized this might be her only chance. She began to scream, her voice raw and desperate, pounding her fists against the cellar doors with all her remaining strength. The voices above stopped abruptly, and she heard footsteps, then Harold's angry shout telling the stranger it was just rats in the cellar, nothing to concern himself with. But Adelaide kept screaming, kept pounding, and she heard the stranger's voice grow sharp with suspicion. Lucas Benjamin had not expected his routine visit to the Duncan Ranch to turn into anything unusual, but the sounds coming from beneath the porch set every instinct he possessed on high alert. He was 24 years old, a cattleman who had built his own small operation through hard work and honest dealing, and he prided himself on reading situations accurately. The way Harold Duncan's face had gone pale, the nervous sweat breaking out on the older man's forehead, the obvious lie about rats, all of it added up to something deeply wrong. "Step aside, Duncan," Lucas said quietly, his hand moving to rest on the revolver at his hip. He was a tall man, lean and weathered from years of working under the desert sun, with dark hair that brushed his collar and gray eyes that could be warm or cold depending on circumstances. Right now, they were very cold indeed as he stared at Harold Duncan and listened to the desperate screams coming from below. Harold's hand twitched toward his own gun, but Lucas was faster, drawing his weapon in one smooth motion and leveling it at the older man's chest. "I said step aside. I will not ask again." The screaming continued, weaker now, and Lucas could make out words. "Help me, please. He has locked me down here. Please help me." His jaw tightened as he gestured with the gun toward the cellar doors. "Open it, now!" Harold's face twisted with rage and fear, but he had no choice with Lucas's revolver trained on him. He fumbled with the bolt, his hands shaking, and pulled open one of the heavy wooden doors. The smell that wafted up made Lucas take an involuntary step back, a mixture of human waste and damp earth and sickness, and then he saw her. Adelaide crawled toward the light like a creature emerging from a cave, her eyes squinting against the brightness she had not experienced in months, her dress in tatters, her hair a wild tangle around a face so thin it seemed skull-like. Lucas holstered his weapon and dropped to his knees, reaching down to help her up, and the moment his hands touched her arms, he felt the trembling that racked her entire body. "Dear God," he whispered, lifting her carefully out of the cellar. She weighed almost nothing, and when he set her on her feet, she collapsed against him, her legs too weak to support her weight. Lucas caught her automatically, one arm going around her waist to steady her, and he looked over her matted hair at Harold Duncan with an expression of pure fury. "How long? How long has she been down there?" Harold said nothing, his face sullen and defiant, but Adelaide spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Since November. He wanted me to sign the ranch over to him. I would not do it. Lucas felt something hot and dangerous rise in his chest, a rage unlike anything he had experienced before. He had seen cruelty during his years in Arizona, had witnessed the worst of what men could do to each other, but this level of calculated abuse towards someone helpless turned his stomach. He tightened his arm around Adelaide, feeling her shiver against him, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Can you ride?" he asked her gently, and Adelaide nodded, though Lucas doubted she had the strength to sit a horse on her own. He kept one arm around her as he turned to Harold, his voice hard as iron. "You are going to stay right here while I take her into Tombstone. You are going to face the law for what you have done, and if you are smart, you will not try to run, because I will track you down and bring you back, and I promise you will not enjoy the experience." Harold spat on the ground, his expression vicious. "That girl is my daughter, and I have every right to discipline her as I see fit. You have no authority here, Benjamin. She is 18 years old and the legal owner of this property," Lucas shot back. "You have no rights here at all, Duncan, and every lawman in the territory is going to know what you did by sundown tonight." He turned his attention back to Adelaide, his voice softening. "Let me get you to my horse. Can you hold on for just a bit longer?" Adelaide nodded again, tears streaming down her filthy cheeks, and she let Lucas guide her toward the hitching post, where his bay gelding waited patiently. The sunlight felt impossibly bright after so many weeks of darkness, and she had to keep her eyes nearly closed against the glare, but the warmth on her face was glorious, and she tilted her head back to feel more of it, despite the pain in her light-starved eyes. Lucas mounted first, then reached down to lift Adelaide up in front of him, settling her sideways across his lap so she could lean against his chest. She did so immediately, too exhausted to care about propriety, and Lucas wrapped one arm securely around her while gathering the reins in his other hand. He cast one final warning glare at Harold Duncan, then urged his horse into a smooth walk, not wanting to jar Adelaide more than necessary. The ride to Tombstone took over an hour, and during that time Lucas felt Adelaide drift in and out of consciousness against him, her breathing shallow and her skin too cold despite the afternoon sun. He talked to her quietly, telling her she was safe now, that he would make sure Harold paid for what he had done, that she was going to be all right, even though both of them knew she was far from all right in this moment. They drew stairs as they rode down Allen Street, Tombstone's main thoroughfare, and Lucas ignored them all as he headed directly for Doc Harrington's office on the corner of 4th Street. He dismounted carefully, keeping Adelaide secure in his arms, and carried her up the steps to the doctor's door, kicking it open when his hands were too full to manage the knob. Doc Harrington looked up from his desk with an expression of annoyance that transformed to shock when he saw Adelaide's condition. He was an older man, silver-haired and competent, and he had practiced medicine in Tombstone since the town's founding. "Good Lord, Lucas! What happened to her?" "Her stepfather locked her in a cellar for 3 months," Lucas said flatly, laying Adelaide on the examination table as gently as he could. "She needs help, Doc, and I need you to document her condition because I am going straight to the sheriff after I leave here." Doc Harrington was already rolling up his sleeves, reaching for his medical bag. "Get out then, boy, and let me do my work. Go talk to Sheriff Matthews and tell him I will have a full report within the hour." Lucas hesitated, looking down at Adelaide's pale face, and she opened her eyes to meet his gaze. Something passed between them in that moment, a connection forged in crisis, and Lucas found himself reaching out to brush a strand of matted hair from her forehead. "You are safe now," he said again, and this time Adelaide believed him. He forced himself to leave, striding across town to the sheriff's office with his jaw set and his hands clenched into fists. Sheriff Matthews was a weathered lawman in his 50s, honest and tough, and he listened to Lucas's story with growing anger creasing his lined face. "Harold Duncan did this?" he repeated when Lucas finished. "Are you certain, son?" "I pulled her out of that cellar myself," Lucas said grimly. "You can see the condition she is in at Doc Harrington's office, And once she is strong enough to give a statement, you will have all the evidence you need. I want him arrested, Sheriff. Today." Matthews stood, reaching for his hat. "You will get your wish. Deputy Grant, saddle the horses. We are riding out to the Duncan place immediately." He looked at Lucas with something like approval in his eyes. "You did good work today, Benjamin. That girl owes you her life." Lucas shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent man would have done the same. "You would be surprised how many decent men look the other way when it is convenient," Matthews replied. "Go on back to Doc Harrington's and make sure the girl is all right. I will send word once Duncan is in custody." Lucas did as suggested, returning to find Doc Harrington just finishing his examination. The doctor's expression was grave as he washed his hands in a basin, and he gestured for Lucas to step outside into the hall with him. "She is severely malnourished and dehydrated," Doc Harrington said quietly. "She has a respiratory infection that could turn to pneumonia if we are not careful, and she is covered in bruises and sores from lying on that cold ground for so long. But she is young and strong, and with proper care, I believe she will make a full recovery. It could have been much worse, Lucas. Another few weeks in that cellar might have killed her." Lucas felt his hands clench again, and he had to take a deep breath to control the anger that surged through him. "What does she need?" "Rest, warmth, good food, and time," Doc Harrington said. "I am going to keep her here for a few days to treat the infection and get some weight back on her. After that, she will need somewhere to stay and someone to look after her. You said the ranch belonged to her father originally?" "That is what she told me. Harold Duncan married her mother and was trying to force Adelaide to sign the property over to him." Lucas paused. "She has no other family?" "I will ask her when she wakes up, but if Duncan was willing to lock her in a cellar, I doubt there is anyone else looking out for her welfare." Doc Harrington studied Lucas with shrewd eyes. "You planning to take an interest in this girl's situation, son?" Lucas met the doctor's gaze steadily. "Someone needs to make sure she is protected. Duncan is not the type to go quietly, even from a jail cell." "That was not exactly what I asked, but I suppose it will do for now." Doc Harrington smiled faintly. "You can sit with her if you like. Might do her good to see a friendly face when she wakes up." Lucas nodded and went back into the examination room where Adelaide lay on a clean cot, covered with warm blankets, her face scrubbed clean to reveal delicate features that would be beautiful once she regained her health. Her hair, now washed and combed by Doc Harrington's nurse, was a rich auburn color, and it spread across the white pillow like dark flame. He pulled a chair close to the cot and sat down, settling in to wait. He was not entirely sure why he felt so compelled to stay, why this girl he had just met seemed to matter so much, but he could not deny the fierce protectiveness that had taken root in his chest the moment he had pulled her from that cellar. Adelaide woke as evening shadows lengthened across the room, her eyes fluttering open to fix on Lucas's face. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, and then memory returned and she tensed, her breath quickening. "Easy," Lucas said softly, leaning forward but being careful not to crowd her. "You are at Doc Harrington's office in Tombstone. You are safe. Duncan cannot hurt you anymore." She studied him with those remarkable eyes, which he now saw were a deep green, and slowly she relaxed back into the pillows. "You are the man who found me." "Lucas Benjamin," he introduced himself properly. "I own a cattle ranch about 10 miles south of here. I was at Duncan's place looking to discuss a business deal, and I heard you calling for help." "Thank God you did," Adelaide whispered, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I thought I was going to die down there. I thought no one would ever know what happened to me." Lucas pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to her, watching as she dabbed at her eyes with trembling hands. "The sheriff has gone to arrest Duncan. He will face justice for what he did to you, I promise you that." "The ranch," Adelaide said suddenly, trying to sit up. "He wanted the deed. If he gets his hands on the papers while I am here, He could forge my signature. He could take everything my father built. Easy now, do not strain yourself, Lucas said, gently pressing her shoulder to keep her from rising. Where are the deed papers kept? In my father's desk in the study. There is a hidden compartment in the bottom drawer on the left side. You have to remove the drawer completely and reach up behind the frame. Adelaide's eyes were desperate. Please, it is all I have left of my parents. I cannot let him take it. Lucas stood, determination written across his features. I will ride out there tonight and get those papers. You have my word, Adelaide. Your property will be safe. She caught his hand before he could turn away, her grip weak but insistent. Why are you helping me? You do not even know me. He looked down at her small hand, wrapped around his larger, calloused one, and felt that strange pull in his chest again, that sense of recognition that defied logic. Maybe I want to know you, he said honestly, and saw color rise in her pale cheeks. But mostly because it is the right thing to do, and I have never been good at walking away from people who need help. Adelaide held his gaze for a long moment, and something shifted in the air between them, a spark of connection that neither of them fully understood, yet but both felt clearly. Thank you, she said finally, releasing his hand. I will never be able to repay you for what you have done today. You do not owe me anything, Lucas replied. Just focus on getting well. I will take care of the rest. He left her then, stopping only to let Doc Harrington know he was riding out to secure Adelaide's property documents, and then he was back on his horse and heading into the gathering darkness. The ride to the Duncan ranch took on an urgency it had lacked that morning, and Lucas pushed his gelding harder than he normally would, arriving just as full night settled over the desert. The ranch house was dark and empty, Harold Duncan presumably sitting in a cell in Tombstone by now, and Lucas lit a lantern he found on the kitchen table before making his way to the study. He located the desk Adelaide had described and followed her instructions, removing the bottom drawer and reaching up into the hidden space behind the frame. His fingers brushed paper, and he pulled out a sheaf of documents, including the deed to the ranch, made out in the name of Adelaide's father, Thomas Donovan. Lucas tucked the papers carefully inside his coat and was turning to leave when he heard a sound from the front of the house. He froze, listening, and heard it again. Definitely footsteps on the porch. His hand moved to his revolver as he moved silently toward the doorway, peering around the corner into the main room. 3 men stood in the parlor, rough-looking characters with guns on their hips and mean eyes that reflected the moonlight coming through the windows. Lucas recognized one of them, a hired gun named Jack Morrison, who had a reputation for taking on dirty work for anyone willing to pay his price. Well, well, Morrison drawled, his hand resting casually on his weapon. Lucas Benjamin, what brings you out to the Duncan place on a dark night like this? I could ask you the same question, Lucas replied evenly, though his mind was racing. Seeing as how Duncan is currently enjoying the sheriff's hospitality in town. Morrison's smile was cold. That is exactly why we are here. Duncan hired us last week to make sure his stepdaughter did not cause him any trouble. Seems like that arrangement still stands, especially now that you have gone and complicated things. Lucas's hand tightened on his revolver, though he had not drawn it yet. If you are smart, you will walk away right now. Adelaide Duncan is under the sheriff's protection, and anything you do to interfere will land you in a cell next to her stepfather. Here is the thing, Benjamin, Morrison said, taking a step forward. Duncan paid us half up front and promised the rest when the job was done. We do not leave jobs unfinished, and we do not care much about what the sheriff thinks. His hand moved toward his gun. Now you are going to hand over whatever papers you are carrying in that coat, and then you are going to forget you ever heard of Adelaide Duncan. Or we can do this the hard way. Lucas drew in one smooth motion, his gun clearing leather before Morrison could complete his draw, and he fired a shot that took the hired gun in the shoulder and spun him around. The other 2 men scrambled for their weapons, but Lucas was already moving, diving behind a heavy wooden table and overturning it for cover. Bullets splintered the table as the two remaining gunmen opened fire, and Lucas returned shots methodically, his training and natural skill serving him well. He caught one man in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor with a howl of pain, and the second man decided discretion was the better part of valor and bolted for the door. Lucas let him go, keeping his gun trained on Morrison and the wounded man on the floor. "You two are going to ride into town with me," he said calmly, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "And you are going to tell Sheriff Matthews everything about Duncan hiring you. Maybe if you cooperate, the judge will go easier on you." Morrison clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted with pain and fury. "You are a dead man, Benjamin. Duncan has more friends than us." "Then I guess I better stay alert," Lucas replied. He gathered rope from the ranch's supplies and tied both men securely before loading them onto their horses. The ride back to Tombstone took longer with wounded prisoners in tow, but Lucas managed it, delivering the men and their story to a very interested Sheriff Matthews just after midnight. The sheriff listened to Lucas's account and examined the deed papers with satisfaction. "You have done outstanding work tonight, son. With these two testifying against Duncan, plus Adelaide's statement and Doc Harrington's medical report, we have an airtight case. Duncan will spend years in prison for what he did." "That is not good enough," Lucas said flatly. "He tried to kill her, Sheriff. She would have died in that cellar if I had not found her when I did." "I know, and believe me, I will push for the harshest sentence possible," Matthews assured him. "But attempted murder is hard to prove when the victim is still alive. We will get him for kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and a few other charges. He will be an old man before he sees freedom again, if he lives that long." Lucas had to be satisfied with that, though the anger still simmered in his chest. He finally made his way back to Doc Harrington's office around 1 in the morning, intending to just check on Adelaide before finding a room at one of the town's hotels. But when he quietly entered the examination room, he found her awake, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. "Cannot sleep?" he asked softly, and Adelaide turned her head to look at him, relief flooding her expression. "I keep thinking I will wake up and find myself back in the cellar," she admitted. "And I was worried about you. You have been gone for hours." Lucas pulled the chair close to her cot again and sat down, noting how her eyes tracked his movements with an intensity that made his heart beat a little faster. "I ran into some trouble at the ranch. Duncan had hired men to come after you, but they are in custody now, and I have your deed papers safe." He patted his coat. "Your father's ranch is secure, Adelaide. No one can take it from you." The gratitude in her eyes was almost overwhelming, and Lucas looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the depth of emotion passing between them. He barely knew this woman, had met her only hours ago, and yet he felt connected to her in a way that defied explanation. "Will you stay?" Adelaide asked quietly. "Just until I fall asleep? I know it is a lot to ask after everything you have already done, but I feel safer when you are here." "Of course," Lucas said immediately, settling back in his chair. "I will be right here. You just rest." Adelaide's eyes drifted closed, and within minutes her breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep. Lucas watched her in the dim lamplight, noting the way her features relaxed when unconsciousness claimed her, the way her hand curled on the blanket like a child's. She was so young, had been through so much, and he felt a fierce determination settle over him. He would protect her, would make sure she had the chance to build the life she deserved, no matter what it took. He dozed in the chair as the night wore on, jerking awake periodically to check that Adelaide was still sleeping peacefully, and when dawn light began to filter through the window, Doc Harrington found him there, still keeping watch. "You look terrible," the doctor observed mildly. "There is a boarding house 2 streets over that serves breakfast. Go get some food and rest, Lucas. I will watch over the girl." Lucas wanted to argue, but his stomach growled and his body ached from the previous day's exertions. He stood reluctantly, looking down at Adelaide's sleeping form one more time, and then nodded. "I will be back in a few hours. Send someone to fetch me if she needs anything." "I will do that," Doc Harrington promised, and Lucas could have sworn he saw amusement in the older man's eyes. Go on now before you fall over. The next several days fell into a pattern. Lucas would appear at Doc Harrington's office every morning, spending most of each day sitting with Adelaide as she slowly regained her strength. They talked for hours, Lucas telling her about his ranch and his dreams of building a successful cattle operation, Adelaide sharing memories of her parents and her own hopes for the future. He learned that she was intelligent and well educated, that her father had believed in schooling his daughter despite the frontier setting, and that she had a quiet sense of humor that emerged as she grew more comfortable with him. She learned that Lucas was an orphan who had come west at 16 with nothing but determination and grit, that he had worked as a ranch hand for years before saving enough to buy his own small spread, and that he valued honesty and hard work above all else. There was something easy between them, a natural rapport that surprised them both, and as Adelaide's physical health improved, Lucas found himself looking forward to their conversations with an eagerness that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. On the fifth day of her recovery, Doc Harrington announced that Adelaide was well enough to leave his care, though she would need to continue resting and building up her strength. This presented a new problem, as Adelaide had nowhere to go. The Duncan Ranch was legally hers, but the thought of returning there filled her with dread, and besides, she was not strong enough to manage a property on her own. Lucas made his decision without much internal debate. "Come stay at my ranch," he said, holding up a hand when Adelaide started to protest. "I have a housekeeper, Mrs. Chin, who lives in a small cabin on the property. She can chaperone, so there will be no impropriety. You need somewhere safe to recover, and I have the space. Once you are fully well, we can figure out what to do about your father's ranch." Adelaide bit her lip, clearly torn between propriety and practicality. "I do not want to impose on you any more than I already have." "You are not imposing," Lucas said firmly. "I am offering, Adelaide. There is a difference." He softened his tone. "Please let me help you. At least until you are back on your feet." She searched his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she finally nodded. "All right, thank you, Lucas, for everything." Mrs. Chen turned out to be a tiny Chinese woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner, and she took one look at Adelaide's frail condition and immediately began fussing over her like a mother hen. She installed Adelaide in the guest room of Lucas's modest ranch house, a comfortable space with a real bed and windows that looked out over the desert landscape, and she began preparing nutritious meals designed to put weight back on Adelaide's thin frame. Lucas threw himself into his ranch work during the days, riding out early to check on his cattle and mend fences, but his evenings were spent on the porch with Adelaide, watching the spectacular Arizona sunsets and talking about everything and nothing. As February gave way to March, Adelaide's strength returned rapidly, color blooming in her cheeks and her body filling out to healthy curves that Lucas tried very hard not to notice. But he did notice, just as he noticed the way his heart lifted when he heard her laugh, the way he looked forward to coming home each evening just to see her smile, the way her presence had transformed his bachelor existence into something that felt like a real home. He was falling in love with her, he realized one evening, as he watched her help Mrs. Chin with the dishes, her auburn hair catching the lamplight and her voice rising in some song she was humming. The realization terrified him. He had never been in love before, had never allowed himself the luxury of thinking about a wife and family when he was working so hard to build his ranch. And Adelaide was too young, had been through too much trauma, might not be capable of returning his feelings even if he was brave enough to express them. But the heart, Lucas was learning, did not much care about logic or timing or appropriateness. It wanted what it wanted, and his heart wanted Adelaide Duncan with an intensity that kept him awake at night, staring at his ceiling and imagining a future that seemed both impossibly perfect and terrifyingly out of reach. Adelaide was grappling with her own confusing emotions. Lucas Benjamin had saved her life, had protected her and cared for her when she had no one else, and it would be natural to feel gratitude toward him. But what she felt went far beyond gratitude, she admitted to herself as she lay in the comfortable guest bed and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. She was drawn to Lucas in ways she had never experienced before, fascinated by the strength in his hands when he worked with leather and rope, mesmerized by the sound of his deep voice when he read aloud from the newspaper in the evenings, captivated by the kindness in his gray eyes when he looked at her. She found herself dressing with more care in the mornings, hoping he would notice, found herself laughing at his jokes with genuine delight, found herself imagining what it would be like if he kissed her. That last thought made her blush in the darkness of her room. She was 18 years old and had never been courted, had never even been kissed, and the idea that she might want Lucas to be the first seemed presumptuous given everything he had already done for her. What if he only saw her as a charity case, a wounded creature he had rescued? What if his kindness was nothing more than duty? The thought made her chest ache, but she could not deny the possibility. Lucas was 24, handsome and capable. Surely he had his pick of women in Tombstone. Why would he be interested in a girl who came with nothing but trauma and a ranch she was too afraid to return to? Spring arrived in earnest, bringing wildflowers to the desert and warming the air, and with it came news that Harold Duncan's trial had been scheduled for mid-April. Adelaide would have to testify, would have to face her stepfather in open court and recount the nightmare of her months in the cellar, and the prospect filled her with dread. Lucas found her crying on the porch one evening, her face buried in her hands, and he sat down beside her without hesitation, his arm going around her shoulders in a gesture that had become natural between them over the past weeks. "I cannot do it," Adelaide whispered against his shirt, which had grown damp with her tears. "I cannot stand up there in front of everyone and talk about what he did. I cannot face him again, Lucas. I am too afraid." "Yes, you can," Lucas said gently but firmly, his hand rubbing soothing circles on her back. "You are one of the strongest people I have ever met, Adelaide. You survived 3 months in that cellar and came out of it with your spirit intact. You can do this. What if he goes free? What if they do not believe me?" The fear in her voice broke Lucas's heart. "They will believe you," he assured her. "Doc Harrington's medical report, my testimony about finding you, the statements from those hired guns, all of it supports your story. Duncan is not walking out of that courtroom a free man, I promise you that." He pulled back slightly to look at her face, using his thumb to wipe away her tears. "And I will be right there with you, every moment. You will not have to face him alone." Adelaide looked up at him, her green eyes swimming with tears and something else, something that made Lucas's breath catch. "Why are you so good to me?" "Because you deserve goodness," Lucas said, the words coming from somewhere deep and honest inside him. "Because you have had so little of it in your life, and I want to change that." He hesitated, then threw caution to the wind and added, "Because I care about you, Adelaide. More than I probably should." Her eyes widened, and Lucas mentally kicked himself. It was too soon, she was too vulnerable, he should have kept his feelings to himself. But before he could take the words back, Adelaide leaned forward and pressed her lips against his, a tentative, inexperienced kiss that nevertheless sent electricity shooting through Lucas's entire body. He froze for half a second, shocked, and then he was kissing her back, one hand coming up to cup her cheek while the other remained around her shoulders. It was a gentle kiss, sweet and exploratory. And when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I care about you too," Adelaide whispered, her cheeks flushed and her eyes bright. "I think I have been falling in love with you since the day you pulled me out of that cellar, and I was afraid you would think I was foolish, or that I only felt that way because you saved me. But it is more than that, Lucas. You make me feel safe and valued and seen in a way no one else ever has." Lucas felt something expand in his chest, a warmth that spread through his entire being, and he kissed her again, longer this time, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, savoring the moment. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it is fast, and maybe it is crazy, but I do not care. I love you, Adelaide Duncan, and if you will let me, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again." "I will let you," Adelaide said, laughing and crying at the same time. Yes, Lucas, yes. They sat on that porch well into the night, talking about the future they both now dared to imagine. And when Mrs. Chen found them the next morning, asleep in each other's arms on the porch swing, she just smiled knowingly and went to make breakfast without disturbing them. The trial came in mid-April, held in Tombstone's courthouse with Judge Samuel Warner presiding. Adelaide sat in the witness chair, Lucas in the front row where she could see him, and she drew strength from his steady presence as she recounted her ordeal. Her voice shook at first but grew stronger as she spoke, and by the time she finished, there was not a dry eye in the courtroom. Harold Duncan sat at the defendant's table with his court-appointed lawyer, his face stony and unrepentant, and when he took the stand in his own defense, he showed no remorse for his actions. He claimed he had been trying to discipline an unruly stepdaughter, that Adelaide had exaggerated her confinement, that he had given her adequate food and water. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Doc Harrington testified about Adelaide's condition when she was brought to him, showing photographs he had taken of her bruises and emaciation. Lucas described finding her in the cellar and the subsequent attempt by Duncan's hired men to interfere. The two gunmen, Morrison and his associate, testified that Duncan had paid them to ensure Adelaide either signed over the ranch or disappeared permanently. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all charges: kidnapping, false imprisonment, assault, and conspiracy to commit murder. Judge Warner sentenced Harold Duncan to 20 years in the territorial prison, and when the gavel fell, Adelaide felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying since her mother's death. Lucas was waiting for her outside the courtroom, and she walked straight into his arms, burying her face against his chest. "It is over," she whispered. "It is really over." "It is over," Lucas confirmed, his arms tight around her. "You are free, Adelaide, free to live your life however you choose." She pulled back to look up at him, and there was a question in her eyes that he read clearly. "Actually," Lucas said, his heart hammering nervously despite the confidence in his voice, "I was hoping you might choose to live it with me, as my wife, if you will have me." Adelaide's face split into a radiant smile. "Are you asking me to marry you, Lucas Benjamin?" "I am," Lucas said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. He had purchased the ring the day before, a simple gold band with a single small diamond, all he could afford on a cattleman's income, but chosen with care. He opened the box to show her. "I know we have not known each other long, but I also know that what we have is real and rare, and I do not want to waste another day without you officially being mine. So yes, Adelaide Duncan, I am asking you to marry me. Will you?" "Yes," Adelaide said without hesitation, throwing her arms around his neck. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Tombstone's church, with Sheriff Matthews standing as Lucas's best man, and Mrs. Chen and Doc Harrington serving as witnesses. Adelaide wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, and she carried wildflowers Lucas had picked that morning from the desert. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed her with such tenderness and love that several people in the small congregation had to wipe away tears. The newlyweds moved into Lucas's ranch house, and Adelaide threw herself into making it a true home. She learned to cook for Mrs. Chen, planted a vegetable garden behind the house, and began raising chickens for eggs and meat. The work was hard but satisfying, and she discovered she had a knack for ranch management that complemented Lucas's skills with cattle and horses. Together, they made the decision to combine her father's property with Lucas's ranch, creating a larger, more viable operation. It meant confronting Adelaide's memories of the Duncan Ranch, but with Lucas beside her, she found the courage to return to the place where she had suffered so much. They hired hands to help run both properties, and within a year, the combined ranch was thriving, known throughout the territory for quality cattle and honest dealings. Adelaide never returned to the cellar, and eventually Lucas filled it in completely, erasing the physical reminder of her imprisonment, even as time began to heal the emotional scars. She still had nightmares occasionally, waking in the darkness with her heart racing, but Lucas was always there to hold her and remind her that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. Their first year of marriage was full of discovery and joy, learning each other's rhythms and building a partnership based on mutual respect and deep love. Lucas taught Adelaide to ride well enough to help him with the cattle roundups, and Adelaide taught Lucas to read beyond the basic level he had achieved on his own, opening up worlds of literature and learning he had never experienced. In the spring of 1887, Adelaide discovered she was pregnant, and the news filled both of them with wonder and a touch of fear. Lucas was terrified of becoming a father, worried he would not know how to raise a child properly, having grown up without parents himself, but Adelaide reassured him with patience and love, pointing out that he had more kindness and integrity than most men who had been raised in traditional families. Their son was born in October of that year, a healthy baby with Lucas's dark hair and Adelaide's green eyes, and they named him Thomas, after Adelaide's father. Lucas held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, overwhelmed by the fierce love and protectiveness he felt for this tiny person, and he made silent promises to be the father his own had never gotten the chance to be. Motherhood transformed Adelaide in beautiful ways. She blossomed with confidence and purpose, managing the household and ranch finances with capable efficiency while nurturing their son with endless patience and love. Lucas would often come in from the range to find her singing lullabies to Thomas, her voice soft and sweet, and his heart would swell with gratitude for the life they had built together. 2 years later, their daughter arrived, and they named her Grace for the grace that had brought them together, despite the darkness Adelaide had endured. She had Adelaide's auburn hair and Lucas's gray eyes, and she was a spirited child who kept them on their toes from the moment she could crawl. As the years passed, the ranch continued to prosper under their joint management. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family, with a wide porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch their children play. Lucas hired a school teacher from back east to educate Thomas and Grace, along with other ranch children, ensuring they would have opportunities he and Adelaide had fought so hard to create. Harold Duncan died in prison in 1892, and when Adelaide received word of his passing, she felt nothing but a distant sadness for a life so consumed by greed and cruelty. She had long since forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own, refusing to let bitterness poison the beautiful life she had built with Lucas. Sheriff Matthews became a close family friend, often joining them for Sunday dinners and bouncing their children on his knee. Doc Harrington delivered both Thomas and Grace and remained their trusted physician and confidant. Mrs. Chin eventually moved into a cottage on the expanded ranch property, becoming beloved Auntie Chin to the Benjamin children and helping Adelaide manage the household as the ranch operation grew. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Lucas took Adelaide back to the spot where he had first found her, where the old Duncan ranch house still stood, now serving as housing for some of their ranch hands. The cellar was gone, replaced by a flower garden Adelaide had planted years earlier, a symbol of life growing from a place that had once held so much darkness. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked as they stood looking at the garden, his arm around her waist. "Everything that brought you here? I know you would rather have had your parents live, rather have never met Harold Duncan at all." Adelaide leaned into him, considering the question seriously. "I wish my parents had lived," she said finally. "I wish I could have known my father better, wish my mother could have met her grandchildren. But regret the path that brought me to you? Never. What Harold did was evil, but it led me to the greatest love of my life. It taught me that I am stronger than I ever imagined I could be. It showed me what real goodness looks like, embodied in a man brave enough to break down a cellar door and set me free." Lucas turned to kiss her, a kiss that held a decade of love and partnership, and still, remarkably, made her heart race the way it had that first time on the porch. "You set me free too," he said, when they parted. "Before you, I was just existing, working toward goals that felt empty. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to build something that matters." They returned to the main house hand in hand, where Thomas and Grace were waiting to present them with the anniversary gift they had made with Auntie Chin's help, a beautiful quilt embroidered with scenes from the ranch and their family life. That evening, they gathered around the dinner table, the four of them plus Mrs. Chen and the ranch foreman and his family, and Adelaide looked around at the faces she loved and felt gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. More children arrived in the following years. Another son, James, born in 1896, and then twin girls Emma and Sarah in 1899. The ranch house echoed with laughter and occasional tears, with the sound of children's footsteps and Lucas's patient voice teaching his sons to rope and ride, while Adelaide taught her daughters to read and calculate ranch accounts. Thomas grew into a serious young man with his grandfather's sense of responsibility and his father's skill with horses. Grace inherited her mother's intelligence and independence, declaring at age 12 that she intended to be the first woman rancher in Arizona Territory. James was the family comedian, always ready with a joke or prank to lighten difficult moments. Emma and Sarah, inseparable as most twins, shared a quiet kindness that reminded everyone of Mrs. Chen. As the new century dawned, Lucas and Adelaide found themselves in their 40s, older and grayer, but still deeply in love. They would sit on their porch in the evenings after the children were in bed, Lucas's arm around Adelaide's shoulders, and talk about the journey they had traveled together. "Do you remember," Adelaide said one night, "how terrified I was the day you found me? I thought I had been broken beyond repair." "You were never broken," Lucas replied firmly. "Hurt, yes. Traumatized, certainly. But the core of who you are, your strength and kindness and resilience, that was always there. I just helped you remember it." "We helped each other remember," Adelaide corrected. "You taught me to trust again. I taught you that you deserved love and family. We built this life together, Lucas, brick by brick and day by day." He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, still carrying a hint of the rosewater she used. "Best thing I ever did was ride out to the Duncan Ranch that day. Best decision I ever made was to listen when I heard you calling for help. Best thing I ever did was refuse to give up hope," Adelaide said. "Even in that cellar, even when it seemed impossible, I held on to the belief that somehow I would survive, that somehow life would get better. I just never imagined it would get this good." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, and Adelaide reflected on the strange path her life had taken. She had been locked in a cellar by a man consumed with greed, had spent months in darkness and cold and fear, had nearly died from neglect and cruelty. But from that darkness had come the greatest light of her life, a love so powerful it had transformed everything. Lucas Benjamin had broken down a cellar door and set her free, but that was only the beginning of their story. Together, they had built a ranch, raised a family, created a legacy that would endure for generations. They had proven that even the deepest trauma could be healed with patience and love, that even the darkest circumstances could lead to unexpected joy. As Adelaide turned 50, the ranch that bore the Benjamin name was known throughout Arizona and beyond for its quality, livestock, and fair dealings. Thomas had taken over much of the day-to-day operations, working alongside his father and learning the business with the same dedication Lucas had shown. Grace had indeed become a rancher in her own right, managing a portion of the property with skill that impressed even the most skeptical cowboys. The younger children were finding their own paths, James training as a veterinarian and the twins showing interest in teaching. Lucas and Adelaide gradually stepped back from active ranch management, spending more time with their growing number of grandchildren and finally having the leisure to simply enjoy each other's company. They traveled to San Francisco one year, a trip that felt like a grand adventure after decades of ranch life, and they spent a month exploring the city and marveling at how different it was from the desert territory they called home. But they were always glad to return to Arizona, to the land they loved and the life they had built. The ranch was their masterpiece, but their real legacy was the family they had created, children and grandchildren who had been raised with love and taught the values of hard work, honesty, and compassion. On their 40th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a celebration that brought together everyone whose lives the Benjamins had touched over the decades. The ranch was filled with guests, laughter, music, and memories shared. Sheriff Matthews, retired now and in his 90s, made the trip from Tombstone to toast the couple who had overcome such darkness to build such light. Doc Harrington had passed years earlier, but his son, who had followed in his father's medical footsteps, was there with his own family. Mrs. Chen, ancient now and moving slowly, but still sharp as ever, sat in a place of honor and beamed with pride at the family she had helped raise. As the sun set on that celebration, Lucas pulled Adelaide aside, leading her away from the party to a quiet spot overlooking the vast expanse of their ranch. The desert stretched out before them, painted in shades of gold and red by the dying light, and in the distance they could see the tiny figures of their children and grandchildren enjoying the festivities. 40 years, Lucas said, shaking his head in wonder. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday I pulled you out of that cellar. Other times I can barely remember life before you. We have had a good life, Adelaide said, leaning against him. A very good life, better than I ever dared to dream when I was trapped in that darkness. We have had a blessed life, Lucas agreed. And I would do it all again, every moment, every challenge, every joy, just to end up right here with you. Adelaide turned in his arms to face him, her green eyes still bright despite the lines that age had etched around them. I love you, Lucas Benjamin. Thank you for breaking down that door. Thank you for setting me free. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for letting me, Lucas replied, and he kissed her as the sun sank below the horizon, painting the sky in colors that seemed to celebrate the enduring power of their love. They returned to the party hand in hand, ready to dance and laugh with their family and friends, to celebrate not just an anniversary, but a life well lived, a love that had conquered darkness, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. Years continued to pass, bringing the inevitable changes that time always brings. Lucas and Adelaide moved into a smaller house on the ranch property, leaving the main house to Thomas and his family, and they spent their days in gentle retirement, tending a garden, reading, and watching their grandchildren grow. In the spring of 1935, Lucas fell ill with pneumonia, and despite the best efforts of modern medicine, he passed away peacefully with Adelaide holding his hand, their children gathered around. He was 74 years old, and he died knowing he had lived a full and meaningful life, surrounded by the love of the woman he adored and the family they had created together. Adelaide grieved deeply, as one does when losing a partner of 5 decades, but she took comfort in her children and grandchildren, in the memories of their beautiful life together, and in the certainty that she would see Lucas again when her own time came. She lived another 3 years, remaining active and engaged with her family, telling stories about the old days to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who listened with wide eyes to tales of the wild frontier their ancestors had helped tame. Adelaide passed away quietly in her sleep in the fall of 1938 at the age of 71, and she was buried beside Lucas on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together. Their children inscribed both headstones with the same simple phrase, "Here lies one who loved well and was well loved in return." The Benjamin Ranch continued for generations, passed down through their descendants, and the story of Lucas and Adelaide became family legend, told and retold around dinner tables and campfires. The tale of the cowboy who had broken down a cellar door to save a young woman, and how that act of courage and compassion had blossomed into a love that transformed both their lives and created a legacy that endured long after they were gone. In the years that followed, when family members faced their own difficulties and darkness, they would remember Lucas, and Adelaide would draw strength from knowing that even the most traumatic circumstances could be overcome, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that courage and kindness were never wasted. The cellar where Adelaide had been imprisoned was long gone, buried under flowers and new life, but its memory served a purpose. It reminded each generation that darkness exists in the world, but so does light, and that sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to break down a door, one person willing to offer help without expectation of reward, to change the course of a life forever. And so the story ended where all the best stories end, with love triumphant, with goodness rewarded, with a legacy that outlasted the lives of those who created it. Lucas Benjamin had broken down a cellar door and set Adelaide Duncan free, but in doing so, he had also freed himself from a lonely existence and created something beautiful that would echo through time. Their love story became the foundation upon which generations built their own lives, a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, in the wildest frontier, the human capacity for love and redemption remained the most powerful force of all.